Hello, good morning all. Deb Myhoff with Communitas. We're in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Technical Advisory Committee for the Needs and Production. And really glad to see you all here. This is our lucky number 13th meeting. I think it's going to be another good one. We have a great agenda, which I'll lay out here in a minute. But before we get there, let's do a quick round of introductions of the staff and project team that are in the room. And Mari, why don't you get us started, please?
Sounds good. Thank you, Deb. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mari Valencia Aguilar, she or they pronouns, housing planner with the Department of Land Conservation Development. Good to see you all and excited to hear from you all. Thank you. I'll pass it over to my colleague, Celestina.
Thank you, Mari. Good morning. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, also a housing planner here at DLCD. Also happy to see you all this morning. Ingrid. You're muted, Ingrid.
Sorry. Yay. Good morning, Ingrid Cordell. I'm here to provide admin support and pass it back to Deb.
Great, thank you. And Thea, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Thea Croman. I'm also a housing planner here at DLCD. I think I know most of you at this point. Great to be here with you and sit in on this meeting.
Excellent. And we have our subject matter experts here, Andre.
Sorry, this is Andre Tremolay with Common Works Consulting, and I'm happy to be here.
And Alan?
Good morning, all. I'm also off camera this morning. I'm Alan Lazo. You see him pronouns. I'm a LCDC commissioner and the former executive director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. Great, thank you all. And our OHCS colleagues aren't here yet, but I'm sure there will be one or two that come into the meeting this morning. So glad you all are here. Mari, could you pull up the slides and we'll get rolling? Thank you. Oh, now I gotta find my slides. Hold on one second all. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So the agenda is relatively simple today, and the goals for the meeting are well, in theory, simple, but also very complex. But simple because we'll be really focusing on the second version of the draft rules, and just sort of Mari and Celestina will run through all the changes that are in version 2 from version 1, and talk about sort of how a lot of those respond to many of our conversations and discussions from other tax and community engagement events. We'll have space for you all to get clarifications on those, and then we will open it up for discussion, really looking to hear from you about how close and well the rules are responding to the charge of the statute, how close you feel like we're getting to a workable rule that's practicable from a technical standpoint, and then also just get some feedback from you all. I'm sure you have ideas about how the language can be strengthened, so we'd love to hear about that, and we can dig into that when we, excuse me, when we get there. And then we'll give you an outline of what's to come. I'm about to lose my voice, so I'm going to hand it over to Celestina to line us out. Holy cow. Line us out for the racial equity framework for today.
Thank you so much, Deb. Give you a reprieve. Good morning again, everybody. So as we have throughout this process, starting off the meeting with a touchstone on the racial equity framework for decision making, and also a call for us to weave this through the conversation. Typically, we've been highlighting one or two maybe of these areas of the racial equity framework for decision making for particular focus. And while we do have a couple of discussion questions at the end that highlight some of the benefits and burdens considerations, For the most part, at this stage and in the coming couple of months, we encourage and invite you all to work with us in really looking at all 8 of these areas as we're honing in here on the rules. So I'll just take a moment to put voice to all of them. We've got historical inequities, benefits and burdens, data equity and data justice, community engagement and empowerment, accountability, restorative justice, decision-making, and measuring and evaluating outcomes and continuous improvement. So at this point, we have, I believe, touched on each of these for at least one meeting, most of them more than one meeting. As we navigate the conversation today, these draft 2 rules, both in the meeting and any written comment that you might offer. Again, you are invited to pull through the threads of all of these as we try and be as responsive as possible, or acknowledge where this program that we are building and the framework that we have maybe leaves something to be desired for any of these areas. And with that, I will hand us over to Mari.
Thank you, Celestina. Now we're gonna kind of move into our overview of the second iteration of draft rules. I'm sure you all have been digging into the material and are well versed on the revisions, but Celestina and myself will do an overview of the high points, not the full breadth, because there are many revisions, but the high points within the multiple sections that got revised in this version 2 in the next few slides. Before doing that, this graphic here on the slide is just to help us orient us around exactly our focus in in this particular committee, and in the components of the specific components that we're focused on as it relates to the entire Goal 10 framework under the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis paradigm. So specifically, we are looking at the contextualized housing need, and we are focused on the housing production strategy. And within those 2 pieces, there's multiple components, as you all know. And so our focus there is within some of the general areas of housing planning, but not all. As you can see, we're not touching on some of those things. But hopefully this gives you kind of a grounding as to where we're at before diving into the rules, which I'll do now. Our overview is the way that we've structured the PowerPoint is starting from kind of the first few pages of the matrix and moving into the pages of the matrix. So I'll kind of name the pages. If you're following along with this slide and the matrix, I'll kind of name the page number to help orient you there. Specifically starting with definitions on page 4 of the matrix. We've had a lot of revisions to this section. In particular, on this slide, we've noted the major either additions, refinements, or removals of specific terms. I'm gonna touch on some of these. Specifically, I want to draw your attention to the definition of action. We've revised that to kind of name other specific tools based on feedback that we received that fall within kind of this committal action definition, as well as kind of clarified the important role that exploratory work plays in the implementation of an action. And this is coming from a lot of discussion here, but also at the RAC about the differences between exploratory work and committal actions, and what that means in the context of the Housing Production Strategy Program for both pieces. So there's clarification there. We also have 2 new terms defined that we've all been working on and touching on since the beginning of our time here in March, which is a new definition for characteristics and a new definition from location. And the definitions were informed primarily from the discussions we all had. So you might recall in March and April, we had deep discussions and teased out what various elements of characteristics could be, as well as location. So want to draw your attention to those 2 definitions. Our intent there was to also respond to a call that we've been working a lot on with regard to these 2 major components of our work, and saw minimal in the rules. So hopefully this kind of responds to that in some way. There's a new definition for exploratory work, kind of in the same vein of trying to better clarify how this work is part of Goal 10 planning, but also hopefully clarifies and acknowledges the differences between what this work really means compared to middle actions, and how it does pertain to the obligations of the HPS program, as I've noted earlier. We have a new definition for, or a new term defining past discriminatory actions or practices related to land and housing access. This term, as you all know, shows up in the contextualized housing needs section. This is just giving us a little bit more ability to simplify the rule language in the contextualized housing need by adding a term, but also enabled us to define and offer a kind of a non-exhaustive list of known past discriminatory actions that are relevant to this particular term and the associated work with it in the contextualized housing need. So please, if you haven't, take a look there. The last 2 pieces that I want to point out here in the definitions is related to a new definition of safe harbor. Another important topic we've been honing in on since the beginning of our time together, and there was some back and forth and about safe harbors generally, and this definition here is in hopes to kind of better clarify the confusion around the role and the utility and the use of a safe harbor in this division generally. Lastly, we did remove the term translation. It does not show up in the division in the rules right now, and this term was originally added here. We defined it because that is kind of what we were talking about early on. We were saying the translation of production targets into housing types, characteristics, locations, but we've moved away from translation and really talking more about a determination. So no longer needing that term, it's been removed. Moving on to the contextualized housing needs section, and that's page 12 of the matrix, if you're following along. Specifically in the preamble of the contextualized housing need, we heard a lot of feedback for this recognition that the principles of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is part of our scope, was missing and not reflected in the preamble. So we've added some language there to hopefully bring that out, and added so please take a look at there. We're again welcoming all thoughts. If it's hitting the mark, great. If it's not, let us know. We also did some minor reorganizations to improve readability, and clarified that other housing related work, for example, some local governments already do fair housing planning work because they're an entitled community. That is very much can be utilized in the completion of a contextualized housing need. That was always part of the rules and draft version 1, but we heard this missing in the rule, so we further clarified that piece there. The next piece here is subsection 1 of the contextualized housing need, and here there's a few changes. I'll name a few, specifically the rule related to the requirement of cities needing to look and understand what past discriminatory actions or practices related to land and housing and how that impacts present day inequities related to racial and ethnic segregation has been amended to clarify that the mapping work, there was always a requirement for that review to include kind of a spatial review to understand the inequities of today. That work is now allowed to be conducted once every 3 cycles of a housing production strategy. However, the comparison work that entails should be done at each cycle. So we've offered clarification there. Another big item here is the restoration of a fair housing issue area that we all were discussing as it relates to patterns of racial and ethnic integration and segregation in the relationship to patterns of affluence and poverty. We heard loud and clear that this is an important fair housing issue area. So we've added that into the list of fair housing issues. Specifically look for F, housing choice for people of all races and ethnicities by addressing and disrupting patterns of segregation and integration and their correlation with affluence and poverty. So we've done some language work there to have this particular fair housing issue area fit within the housing choice frame that we've been discussing. And then lastly, there is a new rule in the contextualized housing need that offers clarity regarding a potential pathway of should a city find themselves in a position where they are not finding any fair housing issues within any of the fair housing issue areas. There is a justification that is now required to say we don't have fair housing issues, and now we must demonstrate through findings that that is the case. So that is now reflected in subsection C of this contextualized housing need, subsection 2 rules. So I'll be interested to hear reactions there on that particular piece. Next is kind of the final subsection of the contextualized housing need, and that is subsection 2, which is related to engagement. We've done some tweaks here too, based on feedback. Specifically, we've added additional language to this rule to further clarify that sufficient recent housing-related engagement, if a city has it, can inform their contextualized housing need work. And so the requirement to do additional engagement is not necessary if they can pull from that engagement. So offering some flexibility to cities in this particular work, in this particular area of the contextualized housing need. And then there was feedback that we received related to confusion around how engagement feedback should be reflected. And we've clarified that all feedback should be reflected, but it can be at the theme level. And really what we're trying to, the intent here is for all major feedbacks to be accounted for, whether it's influencing outcomes or not. And so hopefully that offers a little bit more clarification to cities about their expectations with regard to feedback and how it informs how it should show up in their HPS and how it should kind of ensure alignment with actions or not. Lastly, in version 1 of the draft rule, there were 3 subsections in the contextualized housing need. We've removed the 3rd subsection because originally in the first version, subsection 2 was a short list of other data sources and data elements that a city could dig into to review and evaluate their local conditions that is required in subsection 1. We've moved that list up into subsection 1, which enabled us to kind of remove this section. And so now there are 2 sections in the contextualized housing need. So nothing was removed from this contextualized housing need. If anything, we've just reorganized it such that now we have 2 subsections, and all the components of what you saw in version 1 are still there. It's just reorganized into 2 subsections. I think this is my final slide, and it's around the safe harbor for type mix. We have refined this type mix based on feedback that we've had between version 1 and now. And there's been a couple revisions based on that feedback. First, we heard a lot of feedback regarding the use of the language of provide the opportunity in the rule language itself in version 1 versus kind of plan for language that was in the plain language description column, and a desire for us to reconcile exactly what we mean. And so you will note that we have done that. The type mix has been refined to, in the rule language itself, now uses plan for. This phrase is more of an active rule where cities are required to intentionally incorporate specific housing type mixes into their planning processes. And so the plan for language kind of aligns that with an active role that a city has in promoting and creating the conditions for those housing types. And the HPS program goes beyond, we all know this, it goes beyond zoning for various housing types. So it's about involving the promotion, the incentivizing, and ensuring the development of diverse housing options. And so if given the broader goals that the HPS program has, the plan for language seems to embody that intent more closely. And so that's where we've landed there. And then we had lots of feedback regarding just general revisions of the safe harbor. And we have incorporated most, but not all. Specifically, there was a big call for the type mix to better reflect a distinction between smaller and larger multi-unit attached housing, along with middle housing. So you'll see that the language has been revised to respond to that. Specifically, there's language now that includes single room occupancy housing in the safe harbor requirements themselves, as opposed to how it was before in version 1, where it was kind of on its own. Ooh, did I hear a question? I might just finish here and then yeah, okay. So there's that piece. Then the other major revision is including a multi-unit and single room housing requirement at least 20%, or 20 or plus units to kind of enable type A accessibility, which we heard from specifically in this discussion, from this particular committee, and applying that and acknowledging kind of a similar role that small scale attached multi-unit housing has, and as well as middle housing. So that's been added. And lastly, there is a subsection 3 to further clarify the role of the safe harbor in this particular area of rule. So we've added the definition, we've added kind of the some more rule language here to hopefully ensure that the role and use of that safe harbor and how it plays in the program is kind of better understood there. Okay, I am going to hand this over to Celestina now to finish us off with the rest of the revisions to the rule.
Thank you so much, Maddie. Okay, moving right along, we have a new section. I think this might be our only new section related to questions about how the contextualized housing need will be completed, potentially, completed, adopted, reviewed. What is that kind of final process for the contextualized housing need? So we've added this section called the review of the contextualized housing need to really orient to that moment of when the department has the review and essentially approves the contextualized housing need. And we've offered 2 pathways in the rule. One is oriented as kind of a standard pathway, so there's no need to kind of communicate or reach out to the department if that's the pathway that a city would like to take in terms of completing and having their contextualized housing need reviewed. And that's for the contextualized housing need to be reviewed as part of the housing capacity analysis adoption process, which, as many, if not all of you know, is the post-acknowledgement plan amendment process. And that process and the conclusion of that and DLCD's review of that constitutes a land use decision. And so that's somewhat how the first round of HPSs went, and some of this contextualization of the housing need work that has already happened in some of the housing capacity analysis work in the past has already occurred, in that some of the report of the housing capacity analysis already includes that. So that's part of what has informed using this as the standard path. And also that while the housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy work can in some ways be done in tandem, there is a chronological need that the housing capacity analysis be established before you could really finalize what would constitute your housing production strategy. So that's what some of the thinking there. Of course, interested in y'all's thoughts about all of this. And so because of the potential trade-offs of making the contextualized housing need review part of a land use decision, at least for the purposes of the HPS, there's an alternative option, which is that the city may opt into a segmented housing production strategy review approach. So the contextualized housing need can be submitted to the department early on. It will be reviewed per the review rules that are already defined, and if approved, the city can then proceed with that contextualized housing need being the basis of the housing production strategy and can fold it into the HCA. And for the purposes of the HPS, that's already solid. So again, interested in hearing thoughts on that, and if that accomplishes as best we are able with kind of the tools that we have, options for cities to navigate that portion of this work. And then we have a couple of sections with just some small adjustments, which are the restrictions on housing tenure section and the deadline section. So I just mentioned the one new section, and then the one section that is actually proposed for removal substantively is this restrictions on housing tenure section. And this was an existing rule. It was oriented to ownership and rental tenure types. And so in the draft one, we had oriented the rule to a more expansive spectrum of housing types. But in looking back at this and also hearing a little bit of feedback about whether that's really needed or not, we are proposing at this time to strike it because the fair housing issue area analysis with regard to tenure really sets out even a clearer framework for how a city should determine what kinds of tenure types it might attempt to incentivize. And so it seems redundant and maybe obsolete. And then with regard to the deadline section for both the housing capacity analysis and the housing production strategy, very, very minor word change here. The language in the existing rule oriented to a deadline for the buildable land sufficiency determination, and that just got switched to the housing capacity analysis. So with that, we will move on to the housing production strategy structure. And we've got similarly to the introduction of these set of rules that Mari already mentioned, we have a reintegration or affirmation of the fact that affirmatively furthering fair housing and housing production affordability and choice are central to this work. And so language was added into the preamble of this rule to reflect that in response to feedback here from the TAC. And then we made a number of refinements and clarifications for the most part in the engagement section of the housing production strategy structure. So there were some language refinements. We had clarified that definition of protected classes and also encompassed all of the communities that are named in the needed housing statute explicitly in rule to try and bring together all of the communities that this rule is intended to serve. Also clarified that engagement from other programs and other requirements can be used to contribute to the housing production strategy engagement. And change some naming of that to make sure that we weren't excluding any other engagement work. Clarified some references and citations to the transportation planning rule. So thank you all for your feedback there. We refined some word choice around the interdepartmental charge of this work to be a little bit more inclusive in acknowledgement that not all cities have multiple departments. And then ultimately, at this time, the draft rules still reflect that engagement specific to the action selection part of this process is required in addition to any existing engagement, to build off of any existing engagement and make sure that those actions chosen have community input. And then we've got the actions to meet current and future housing needs section itself, which really outlines the building of the strategy action by action. So we've got a number of refinements here. We've got explicit acknowledgement of rehabilitation and adaptation as part of what the actions can accomplish in addition to housing production more purely and preservation. We also did some timeline adjustments in response to feedback, and even some of this was adjusting the existing rule to remove the need to identify months for timelines for actions in the HPS, and shifted the language such that adoption timelines are only needed if applicable, because some actions will not have a formal adoption. There's another item in here that we clarified from original rule about tracking in terms, sorry, give me a second here. There's a requirement in the action by action portion of this strategy to identify how this action will be tracked. And the term that's used currently is how this action will be implemented, and the tracking of that. But really, we clarified that what we're interested in is the outcomes of the action. So not tracking, well, we've adopted and the program is now being implemented, for example, even though we do track adoption separately. It's more about what are the outcomes of this action, and what ideas do you have as a city about how you might be able to track the efficacy and the outcomes of this particular action. In terms of the benefit and burdens analysis section, we actually dialed it back a bit in a sense to note that the 3 named communities are the focus communities where the benefits and burdens analysis must occur, and that benefits and burdens analysis for every protected class, for every action, is not required. Of course, jurisdictions are invited to do as extensive work here as possible, and there will always be benefit to that. But to try and focus efforts and capacity, limited the requirement there to just the 3 named communities. Again, it's minor language refinements, but just trying to be inclusive and comprehensive. Included that relevant implementation details can be named as part of the action description, in addition to complementary actions. So thinking through how an action is actually going to be rolled out such that it will be most effective. And then one note here that kind of comes up in a number of places throughout the rules, or is relevant, but we're naming here in this presentation, which is that based on a conversation at both the NAPTAC and the RAC, implementing a true restorative justice approach is not something that's incorporated in this round of rules, based on the constraints of really handing over that decision-making authority to folks who've been harmed, and the complications in trying to establish that in rule for a number of reasons. So that true implementation of restorative justice is not in draft 2 of the rules. And lastly, just a kind of a concurrency isn't the right word, but an alignment here in the midpoint reporting section. So we just wrapped up the crafting of the strategy section. And in terms of the midpoint report, there's a reflection of efficacy requirement for cities to offer their thoughts on how the actions they've already implemented are working. And in consultation with our colleagues at the department, we went ahead and added just a call for cities who do have climate-friendly areas to also specifically consider the efficacy of their housing production actions in those areas and their efficacy, and kind of naming those separately. So with that is our walkthrough. Of course, there are some very, very or much more subtle changes as well that we didn't name every single one, but they are named in the rules. And if we didn't name something that you are interested in hearing about, please don't hesitate to chime in with whatever feedback you want to offer. We just tried to do our best to give you a fairly comprehensive but not too detailed review. And with that, I'll hand it back to Deb.
Thank you, Celestina and Mari, for the speed review. Well done. Here's what I think we should do. I think we should spend a few minutes getting any clarifying questions you have. Again, not commentary or opinions, but just like you heard something that was just said and you'd like to make sure you heard it right. Or you read something in your review that you'd like to get clarity on, and then we'll shift into discussion. We have sort of an hour and 10 minutes-ish, but before we shift into discussion, I'll line you out on the questions, but let's just do clarifications needed, please. Thank you. Shannon, go ahead.
Thanks, Deb, and thank you for this great overview. I have definition confusion, I think, around the new 0105 contextualized safe harbor. I think there are 3 definitions that I'm confused about. Actually, the larger multi-unit attached, is it intended that like all 20 units touch? Or often in multifamily development, right, you could have 4 or 5 plexes, and that would meet like a HUD standard for multifamily development. I'm just really confused about these, or because those are 4 groups of 5, is that intended to be a smaller multi-unit? I'm just confused.
Yeah, typically in the housing types conversation and those that have definition in statute, we have middle housing, and then what is typically considered or called multifamily, which we're trying to transition away from. So in trying to transition away from that, we could just call it multi-unit generally, but what's currently being used is multi-unit attached. And so if that causes an issue, you know, that's certainly something we can dig into. And then there's single family, and that item is typically referred to as single unit detached, because that distinction is important on that end. Because single unit attached, right, as you well know, we could be talking about townhouses, for example. So the flag potentially that a development with multiple fourplexes, you know, not understanding how that would be accommodated by the attempted distinction here is something that we could consider, and maybe it's just multi-unit instead of multi-unit attached.
Or if we're talking about like something to do with like units per land, again, I feel like it could potentially be accomplished different ways by different structures, but if the intention is all 20 units are in the same building, I'm just really confused about these definitions as written. And similarly, I guess I'm not recollecting, so maybe I just missed it before. I saw a lot of references to single family occupancy or SFOs. And just like, do college dorms count? Because it didn't say housing with services that are single family occupancy. So I just, all 3 of those definitions I'm really struggling with. Thank you.
I could offer on the single room occupancy definition is defined in statute, and I think we reference it. I'm not sure. But that one we wouldn't be changing at the rule level. And that's, we don't need to spend time digging into what that statutory definition. But
if it would be possible to drop that definition into chat or send it to us, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, Shannon, maybe I can do that too, but I might refer you to page 11 of the matrix. Number 31 is exactly the citation for single room occupancy. Yeah.
197A 430, the ORS. All right, Michael, clarification needed. Again, we're trying to stick to clarifications for at least a couple minutes here.
Okay, I'm gonna have a hard time sticking with it. I have another meeting in 15 minutes, but I'll do the best I can. But just to piggyback on Shannon's comment with the attached, I think clarification is needed in that safe harbor and maybe even in other areas where we have a veteran housing project that's for low income subsidized, and a lot of them have mental health issues and they cannot have attached units. But yet we're able to meet the multi-unit in a cottage home type environment. And so I think clarification in those definitions to allow for more options than just attached would be very helpful. And then the other thing, maybe on the clarification side, I just wanted to, I think Maria had this in her presentation, just with the housing production strategy, is that rather than produce housing, we're planning for housing in that strategy. But I think there's a conflict with the housing acceleration program, because there's a midpoint check-in, and that entire section on the acceleration program seems to be focused on the production of housing, not planning for housing. And I think it's fair to expect cities to plan for housing. And I think the amendments have done a great job in taking all of the comments in that have been heard about cities planning for housing, but not actually having to build them because we're not developers. But the housing acceleration program seems to penalize cities that are not producing the housing that they plan for. And so I think there's a disconnect that needs to be evaluated there.
Okay, take a look.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brock, question for clarification.
Yeah, and I'll second Shannon's comment about the attached piece with multifamily, but related to the same safe harbor rule here. For a, well, I guess, are there any existing examples of 20+ unit SROs? Because aside from like a college dorm, the only, like a dormitory is the only thing that comes to mind when I think about that. And I understand like trying to group it in with the multi-unit housing, but I don't necessarily think that generally what we're going to be planning for is like dormitories for people to live in. So I don't know if any of those already exist or if there's any examples of it. But that just something doesn't click there for me.
Okay. Tara, please.
Thank you. Good morning. I had a question about the segmented HPS and how that would function. I think what I heard was the contextualized housing need can be submitted early, and that would be kind of the first segment of the HPS. And then it would be reviewed, and if it's accepted, it could be rolled in or folded into your HCA. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were to do the segmented process, it would be reviewed and adopted, and then would apply both to the HCA and the HPS. Of course, the entirety of the HCA process is still subject to the, the PAPA process, the post-acknowledgement plan amendment process, but you could get confirmation from the department on that contextualized housing need portion first and begin working on your housing production strategy as well.
Okay, so I think then this just might be a difference in how we talk about it. I think once it's accepted as that first segment of the HPS, it couldn't actually be folded into the HCA locally because your housing capacity analysis would have already been adopted, right? And so it wouldn't be locally adopted as part of the HCA. I think it would just end up being locally adopted as part of your HPS. So it might just be a language difference in how we talk about it. Because if your HCA has already been locally adopted, it couldn't be folded into that. It would probably end up needing to be folded into the HPS.
So I'll just clarify that actually the intention of this process would be to do the contextualized housing need first. So
for the HPS is what you mean by first?
No, before both the HCA and the HPS.
Okay, so then I just think, yeah, maybe then if you could clarify that, because that's not what I heard. So there probably is some clarification needed. If you do it first, then it, I think, would be a, yeah, then it's just not clear to me how it'd be a segmented HPS.
Yeah, so currently the HPSs are submitted and they have like the current, the current rule has a contextualized housing needs section in the HPS that's required. And commonly, folks were referencing lots of work in their HCA, in their kind of housing production strategy, contextualized housing needs section, and then sometimes building on that further. And so a lot of the contextualized work has been happening in the HCA already over time, kind of a discussion of the housing need. And so the idea here is to pull that contextualized housing need out and have it be its own piece that gets completed and informs both the HCA and the HPS. But if you'd like it to be reviewed first and not subject to a land use decision process, then you could segment your HPS review, like the rules that govern how an HPS is reviewed are staff level, departmental level decisions, not land use decisions and not part of the PAPA process. So in segmenting the HPS review with a contextualized housing need review early on first in the manner of an HPS review, staff department level review, you can then kind of complete that portion and say, this is our need, we're going to now do the rest of the work.
I think I'm understanding you. I think it's just, let's take into account how things are adopted locally, right? So I think that completely accounts for how they're adopted and reviewed at the state level. But I think, with the segmented HPS, it would just sort of be clear that it's adopted as part of the HPS, even if it's reviewed by the state before that and kind of completed before that. So I think what you're saying makes sense. It's taking me a little bit to translate it into how it needs to be adopted and how that will work out at the local level. So making sure that's clear for cities is going to be important.
We'll definitely take a look at this. And I mean, we want feedback on it, right? This is a response from Cities Ask on how to do this. But I believe the word adoption was used intentionally to reflect that it would be a third adoption. This path to have that contextualized housing need reviewed separately, not in the land use decision context, would mean an adoption at that time of that portion.
Okay, then to me, I don't think of it's its own separate thing. It's not really segmented as part of the HPS. If it's a third adoption, then it's a third adoption. It's not part of your HPS. And I think we should kind of make that clear, because what that means for cities is they're going through a third process with their city council and another resolution, et cetera. And so that I wouldn't consider that a segmented HPS. It's a third adoption, third resolution.
So in terms of the authority to review and the rules that are being used to review, it would be part of the HPS review. So that's why, from like a programmatic standpoint, it would have to be that way. But very, very much understand that there are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs to doing it that way versus kind of proceeding with just a dual HCA HPS adoption.
I think I'm hearing what you're saying, Tara, which is maybe the word segmented is adding some confusion and then maybe just reviewing that portion and making sure it's as tight as it can be.
Thank you.
Great.
Tara, I might just also welcome if you have any thoughts on how to do that clarification, please send those in. Yeah, thank you.
Let me just take these last two clarification questions, and I know, Brock, you have a question or thoughts about, and I'd like to go back to that. But Matt, please, thanks for your patience.
No worries. So I just had two questions. The first one was kind of back to that SRO question. When I look at the definite or the rule language, first, it's great that this was added, the specification about 20 units or greater. I am curious, the language is 50% of new residential units to be attached multi-unit and single room occupancy. And I'm curious if it was intended that these need to be multi-unit and SRO, or if it was intended more to be like multi-unit or SRO. And that conjunction word "and" is pretty significant. So that's one question. And then the other question was, I saw that when you were reviewing, you mentioned the added section on the review of contextualized housing need. If it's adopted as part of the housing capacity analysis, the review is a land use decision. And I guess my clarifying question is, this is just me not knowing everything. That means that it's appealable, correct? Okay, I see nodded heads. All right, that answers that question. Thanks.
Do you all have any response to the multi-unit and SRO conjunction? Go ahead, Celestina.
Yeah, so since it's planning for, we're trying to name multiple housing types, just like in the other one, planning for multi-unit that's 19 units or fewer and middle housing, not that middle housing and multi-unit 19 units or fewer would be like a merged single housing type. So maybe there's a way that we can describe that, but it is an and, because if it were an or, then a jurisdiction would be able to plan for only one or the other. So maybe there's some thinking we can do there.
That makes sense. I understand.
Great. Thank you. Garland, question.
I have a comment, responding to Brock. We do have SROs, both old ones and new ones in the Portland area. And they're not student housing. They've been used for over 100 years to provide affordable housing for folks who need cheap rooms. And indeed, we're building new SROs in the Portland region. I know Eli Spivak of Orange Splot has brought a couple to market in partnership with the national co-living organization that appeals to young professionals or anyone else who wants to have a lower priced option aside from condominiums for living in community. So applaud the state for building SROs into rule and hope people seriously consider this as an option statewide to provide less expensive co-living or housing options.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't want to say it shouldn't be an option. I just wasn't sure if 20 unit SROs existed. SROs generally, I'm not.
They do exist. They can be up to 100 units if you have a multi-story building.
Okay, thank you.
All right, more clarification, or are we moving on to comments at this point, folks? Okay, I hear comments or maybe clarification still. All right, Brianne, please.
Okay, just quickly, maybe piggybacking on what Tara was asking, but just to make sure that I understand, there's kind of three different components. There would be your contextualized housing needs analysis. There's your housing capacity analysis, then your housing production strategy. I kind of assumed you, based on my understanding, is you could roll in your contextualized housing needs analysis into your housing capacity analysis potentially. Alternatively, you could do the segmented 3 separate things. If you did the 3 separate, the contextualized housing needs analysis would not be a land use decision and would not be appealable. Is that correct? Okay.
Right.
So you'd just be adopted locally and then it would be looked at. I guess I'd have to think about like how you'd actually adopt that then for that to, so it wouldn't be a PAPA. Okay.
Right.
But if you roll it in, it's appealable potentially, or it's a land use decision. Is that correct?
If you roll it into your housing capacity analysis adoption process, which is through the PAPA process, then it is at that point appealable. However, if you if you do it differently, such that you do your contextualized housing need on your own, it informs both of these 2 deliverables, the HCA and the HPS. You submit it to the department, we review, separate from your HCA adoption process, then that's different, right? It's not appealable at that point.
Okay.
If you submit it through the HPS, as it is now an existing
part
rule,
of, right? Okay.
Exactly.
I just want to make sure I understood that. That's good, and that's helpful for a lot of reasons. I think that way you could use it actually for other planning purposes and not just necessarily for your housing capacity analysis and your housing production strategy. We could use it for our CFA designation and for other things to inform other things. So that's helpful. Okay, thanks for the clarification.
I'll just add one thing too, which is that we have an outstanding question to legal counsel about this, because just to note that that doesn't mean that your housing capacity analysis or anything therein isn't appealable. So there is like a tension here that we can't quite fully get around, in that your HCA as submitted, which would include your contextualized housing need, kind of that process remains appealable.
And yeah, your housing capacity analysis is, but the contextualized housing need portion of it is not.
So our current understanding is that anything that's submitted, right, as part of that PAPA is appealable. So
but we don't have to do that. We could choose to segment it. I mean, I guess segmented doesn't, this is why I guess I'm confused, because if segmented doesn't exist, then you do basically, I mean, I'm hearing kind of 2 things. One, I thought that they could be segmented and one wasn't appealable and the other 2 were land use decisions. But now I'm hearing maybe it does actually have to be part of your housing capacity analysis and therefore it is appealable. Okay, maybe we could just follow up for clarity on it, because I kind of get it.
No, I understand. This is a conversation we've had internally, and it's complex because there's nothing that we can do to change that everything that is submitted in the PAPA process is appealable and is a land use decision. So that's kind of the ask that you all have made, is how can we not have this part of that process? And we can't change that part. We can't change that anything, our understanding, and we'll get confirmation from legal, but anything that's the basis of your HCA is appealable at that time. But from the department's perspective of you being able to move forward and do your work for the housing production strategy, for example, and not be kind of in limbo potentially if your HCA is appealed or if something about that is being contested, to be able to complete, at least from like the goal 10's perspective, that that you've got that portion done. That's what the segmented review is intended to try and provide, even though we can't fully get around the fact that the HCA is a land use decision and is appealable. So the reason I wanted to add this is because there is still a gray area and a tension, and I didn't want to convey that
it's clear. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense because everything in your HCA is going to be relying on the data in there. So yeah. Okay. And then the other, I guess, just kind of clarification, but I think it's already been brought up, is that I really don't understand the 20 units, 19 unit attached in the safe harbor. That's not the way cities regulate. Like, that's not the way we would regulate. We don't regulate that. If you're multi-unit development, you are 5 or more units. So if the intent is to have this smaller scale multi-unit development, then I think there's better ways to get there through density or through other requirements. Otherwise, like the city, we don't regulate. If someone came in at 19 units, we were only regulating the density, if that makes sense. Anything above 5 and or more attached. Yeah, it was confusing.
I see Andre's hand up. I think you'll provide a little clarity on the connection to ADA standards, I'm guessing. But Andre, go ahead.
Actually, that's not what I was going to respond to.
Sorry.
I just have a separate question. So sorry, no clarity here.
Oh, darn it. All right, let me get Rachel's question and then I'll come to you, Andre, and then we're going to move along to discussion because we're sort of vacillating here. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thanks. This might be, hopefully it's an easy question. Just wondering if I could get some clarification on the definition of attached multifamily or multi-unit housing. I can think of instances where there's one multi-unit development, but it's on 2 separate lots, and within the development it says it means attached housing where each dwelling unit is not located on a separate lot, and I don't want that to trigger one development being classified as something else or needing to go into, for example, an OHCS NOFA as 2 developments.
Yep. A really good point. I don't know, Mari or Celestina, if you have any additional reflections on that, or that's just something that needs to be worked through.
I think so. I think that's something that definitely good feedback to it for us to chew on and see. I think the original, I don't think we amended this definition from the first version, but something that was picked up from existing rule. So thank you for that note and for us to chew on and on next version.
And I would just add that the definitions for planning purposes, hopefully, and would want additional feedback on that, but the things that a city is doing to try and incentivize and promote different types of housing, hopefully wouldn't preclude or like mean that you can't apply for a funding source that might define it differently or anything like that. Like in this framework, we're trying to get those promotion actions to this variety of housing types. But if we are then promoting a housing type that's or limiting the promotion of a particular housing type, I think that's where we would want to make sure that we're not doing that.
Not just about regulation, but also about promotion. I see 2 hands up. I'm gonna just ask Mari to pull up the discussion questions really quick because I think we need to go there. And then if you have clarifications, you can pull those into the conversation. Mari, are you able to pull that up again? Really? Okay.
Yeah, let me get there. Yeah,
So we have
see that.
sort of 45 minutes or so here to continue the discussion. There are lots of things to be said. There were lots in the summary overview, as you heard. We definitely would like to hear which portions of the rule you think are most solid. I think we're starting to hear through the clarifying questions areas that need some more thinking and refinements. So we got that. But more, we'd definitely like to hear about specific refinements or rule language. I see in the chat there was already one tossed out. That chat, send one to Ingrid, that's fine, or Maria Celestina, or we can send it in by email later, or you can voice it here today. And then I really want us to make sure we are also thinking through collectively and discussing which area of the rules could further implement those various elements of the racial equity framework. And specifically would like to hear if you think there's areas where the rules are potentially unintentionally creating some new barriers that we're just not thinking about, or burdens for certain communities, how that might be addressed, or if there's other potentially unintended consequences of the rules that we should be thinking about and potentially mitigating. So I really want to highlight those especially. And then, of course, we are more than welcome to hear all the other things and ideas and perspectives and opinions you have about the rules. I will do the best I can to hear from as many of you as possible in the next 45 minutes, and then we'll have to do written comment beyond that. And staff's ears are wide open. And before we close out, we'll give you a little outline of the schedule ahead so you have a sense about when it's most helpful to provide comments. So, okay, thank you for that. You can go ahead and take the discussion questions down. Shannon, thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. So I've reviewed the safe harbors brief several times, and I'm struggling to understand. I just want to say that first. So this may not be landing or correct, right? But it seems to me that I was surprised that we got to this point and there's such an emphasis on unit size mix with what appears to me to be affordability as some kind of overlay after size mix. So I just went and read the SRO definition, right? And it seems like dorms qualify. As I read that definition, fine. So Corvallis built some dorms. If what we're trying to do, right, if what we're trying to do is promote permanently affordable or permanently supportive housing, then we should promote permanently supportive housing. And that's different, right? It's the focus on that housing type, which is not just about configuration. And so for me, I'd like to see bonuses implemented at cities of all sizes where developers are rewarded for affordability with density, not where density comes first and affordability is an afterthought. That seems backwards from my perspective. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Matt.
So the first thing I want to do is address this question about density and the 20+ unit requirement and where that's really coming from. I think it's being influenced by one of the major components and goals of this process is to produce more accessible housing in terms of physical accessibility. And unfortunately, under the building code, the only units that are required to be type A accessible or the higher accessibility level are in buildings that have 20 or more units. It's the only type of building that requires type A units. And that's an issue because type B units, which are those units that are in buildings that are 4 or more dwelling units, those are merely adaptable. They don't actually provide the level of accessibility that people with real mobility disabilities have. And there's a really critical shortage in those physically accessible units. And that's what the rule, I think, is trying to get at here by having a 20 or more target. And I think it's important. I think the other way that cities could go, or that the rules could go about doing this, is to essentially, set a target. I guess what I would say is, if you target it, they will build. So if you have something like a 4% target for type A units, then the city would have, then a city would think about what policies or strategies would get them to that type A unit threshold of 4%. And I think what DLCD is encountering is a difficulty in terms of they don't have control over the building code. So they can't change that 20 unit standard for type A units, the 20 unit threshold for type A units to be lower. So they have to go about this by trying to incentivize or trying to get cities to plan for more of the larger apartment complexes, because that's the only way we're going to get at these type A units. And, there's about 15% of the population that we know of that have mobility issues. And this is a very small slice of that need, basically. So I think that explains. I think hopefully that's a clearer explanation. But let me know if I can add any more.
Matt,
if I could just jump in, this is Andre. Matt, I wish that cities could require 4% type A units. My understanding from kind of extensive dialogue online with the building code division is that cities don't have the ability to require any, I'll say, either levels or percentages of accessibility beyond that which is in the state building code, that they're specifically prohibited from doing so by state law. And so it would require an amendment to state law for that to go to allow cities to raise 2% to 4%, as you're suggesting. The thing that cities can do, however, is incent. And so they can use whatever things that they have in their toolbox there to incent a higher level of accessibility. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of good news. I wish I had a better outcome there.
Well, yeah, I think maybe I misspoke to say required to 4%, but I think the safe harbor would be for cities to plan for 4% of type A units. How they get there is something that's flexible for the cities, right? There are different policies and strategies to get there. It could be tying higher requirements in terms of, government-funded affordable housing, or it could be those incentives that you're referring to, like higher density bonuses or FAR bonuses, things of that nature. So I agree with you. I think it would be challenging. I don't know if they can just say a straight up 4% of all units must be, but to plan for 4%, cities have tools available to get there. And part of it is building structures that are 20 or more units, but then there's also ways to do it through funding and other like zoning incentives. So
I
think
agree.
you made a really good point.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Much more to think about how to refine that safe harbor. Brock, please go ahead.
So I'll have two. One, page 8, number 18, where we're talking about location, specific geographic position or series of places within a city's boundaries. And I don't know if this has cascading effects throughout the rest of the rule, but does that include planned expansion areas, right? Because if you're under CFEC, if you're doing an expansion, you either have to add or expand a CFA within the current boundary or add a CFA within the expansion area. But if you plan to have that CFA in the expansion area, but it's not already added, does that count as location as far as access to amenities is concerned? That one's a little bit more abstract, but just a thought there. Basically just like existing or just is planned okay. The other piece, and oh no, did we lose Mitch?
We might have lost Mitch.
shoot, I think we did.
Yep.
Well, this is really wonky. It comes down to the methodology changes, and maybe this is not the most up-to-date one, but what I'm looking at right now from May, as far as looking at like population growth and things like that, it subtracts out group quarters. And maybe it's just because this isn't in depth enough to have a definition of that. But if you have, because like I looked online, and Garland, thank you for bringing this up. And, you know, found like 3 examples of like, 20 plus unit SROs in Portland, but all the ones that were there talked about having, services built in, whether that's like healthcare, social services, whatever that is that what's considered group quarters? And if so, is that something that's accounted for in your production target? And I know that, if we don't have Mitch, we might not be able to answer that right now, but I guess is that when you're putting together your type mix, right, is that one where like the numbers that you're getting include that kind of like group quarter supportive service living, or is that potentially separate? Because either way it needs to be produced, but I'm just trying to figure out as far as like the count the city receives from DAS. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, we just wouldn't be able, or we wouldn't be able to pursue that conversation here in the TAC, and frankly, Marty and I probably aren't the folks that have the answer.
Okay, hopefully Mitch comes back.
But question noted, and also suggestion to look at that location definition and think through whether expansion areas or those areas being planned for being in city boundaries should also be included. Got it. Thank you. Julia.
Yeah, thanks. Wanted to kind of layer onto some of what Matt and Shannon were bringing up, and then I also, I guess, kind of a clarifying question. So I guess with the safe harbor, I would agree that ideally, right, this is kind of like a both and in terms of there's land use actions, there's incentives, there's all these things that really actually get us to like be responding to the various different needs that we're talking about here. I also feel like to a degree, the challenge with the safe harbor conversation is we're kind of feels like we're trying to take a square peg and put it in a round hole a little bit sometimes, in that like I think that this safe harbor as drafted is meant to be responding to one particular piece of the contextualized housing need that is technically as written separate from a lot of the things that we all are acknowledging are also important in housing. And I think that's why all of us, myself included, keep trying to like glob on more things into these safe harbors, because we recognize that it is a holistic issue and not just like these things that exist in silos. So I think maybe it would be helpful either in the rules language to further clarify what this is actually safe harboring from. I feel like it's still a little mushy to me in terms of kind of understanding like what do cities then not have to do if they do the safe harbor, and what do they still have to do if they do that safe harbor? Because like to me, I don't think that by doing the safe harbor, then they're off the hook across the board for 0 to 30% AMI or for accessibility. And I don't think that's what you're trying to say by this either, but I feel like based on the conversation, it's still not clear. So I just kind of wanted to layer in there with all of that, I really like all the ideas everyone's throwing out in terms of incentives and all these other things, but I think it is technically as written in this rules separate from what we're talking about in that safe harbor. But I would love to still see those things in the rules more, also lifted up and also incentivized and also maybe required through other safe harbors. So that's that. And then I was wondering if staff could maybe clarify a little bit more on the thought between the difference between action items, exploratory work, which was one of the definitions that's also, I think, been added or shifted that we didn't, maybe that was in the initial draft, but we haven't talked about it. And basically what counts and doesn't count within the HPS process, because I think I'll just put in my plug for wanting to make sure that things like exploratory items and things like that are, I don't know, I want cities to get some credit for putting those in there, because I think there are things that are important that need to happen that inherently are going to be exploratory items. Like you can't just put in your HPS, we're going to adopt an SDC waiver. Like a city has to go through a process to explore that and make sure it's like financially feasible. But if they, certain cities, if they don't get credit for doing that exploration, just won't do it then. And like SDC waivers can be a pretty powerful tool. And so like some cities will still do it, but I just want to make sure we're thinking about how to encourage cities to do these explorations that hopefully lead to a very powerful action, as opposed to discouraging them from doing it because they don't get credit for it, and holding them accountable if they don't then do an action after that exploration is completed. So I just I'm wondering if there's a little bit more clarity around what staff are thinking on that topic at this point in time.
Let's go there first, and Andre, I see you have your hand up, so we'll circle back. But Madi, I see you came off mute. Sort of maybe some additional thoughts about the exploratory action section that got added.
Yeah, maybe I can begin, and Sistina, if you want to jump into, feel free to. So I don't think we actually heard loud and clear, and we saw even in the first round of the housing production strategies that follow the existing rules, not the rules we're working on right now. Cities are doing exploratory work, and I think, and that's all great. It's not discouraged in the program at all, and it was never discouraged in the first iteration of the draft rules. Our attempt here was to be responsive to feedback about, it seemed as that was what our first iteration of the definition of action was kind of saying, a discouraging of exploratory work. So what we try, so just to confirm, that's not the intent. So our attempt here in version 2 was to further clarify that, and by kind of ensuring that exploratory work plays a role in the housing production strategy program. There is intersections with the action itself, but it isn't. But it is distinct from an action because it's not committal. And so our attempt with having a definition that covers exploratory work is trying to parse that piece or that nugget out a bit. That said, I am interested to hear a little bit more about credit, like the credit that you're seeking for local governments to have, because I think something to keep in mind is the program is built such that the actions collectively in the housing production strategy address housing need. And so that really is the important piece of the program, and what we're trying to flesh out between these two actions is not inhibit exploratory work, but also reinforce that the obligation is to take meaningful action to address housing need via the housing production strategy action. Yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I think I need to learn a little bit more what credit you're seeking in terms of local governments having, because nothing, like I said, I don't think there's nothing in rule or statute that inhibits exploratory work. So just trying to further clarify that.
Just for visual aids, that is why I was using air quotes when I said credit. Like, I'm not actually saying that there's something in the rules that are saying that, but I don't know, maybe, I don't know if Tara wants to jump in here, but like, I remember Tara like very specifically bringing up that when she was going through her HPS process, that she was like basically discouraged from putting like exploratory items into her HPS by the consultants. And like, I want to make sure that that is crystal clear, that it is not discouraged. And again, that there are ways that cities also then are held accountable though, if those exploratory items result in non-action. Because that's kind of the point of them. So it's twofold, right? Like that, I think that, again, I don't want like us there to be an inhibitor to put in exploratory things in there because it's not an action item, and cities need to actually take action from those exploratory items. And if they don't, they need to have a backup plan that is like very clearly committed to in their HPS or something along those lines. This is in the letter that we submitted from our coalition in great detail, if that's helpful to read it in writing, but I just wanted to say it out loud here to make sure I was understanding where the current draft is in terms of that definition as well. So I'll leave it at that, but yeah, thank you.
Right. And I would just, thank you, Julia. I would just add, if the conversation's going to continue, that second portion was what I would follow up on, about how there's some accountability that action happens, which is what we had tried to do in this current draft rule. So if there is an actual construction, at this point, we are particularly welcoming, rule language or alternatives for consideration, because currently the program is oriented to actions and completion of actions. And so if we have an action that is a study, then there is no, if the study was completed, that is satisfaction of that item. And there is no accountability beyond that. And so the attempt here is to say that, of course, many actions require some preliminary findings and studies to implement. And so exploratory work can be the first step in an action. And then there's this link to, the possibility that a city can propose an alternative action if in beginning to do the work, they find that maybe this action isn't as suitable as they thought it was. They'd like to meet this need a different way. That's this piece in the midpoint review that we've also heard some mixed feedback on, but about a city's ability to shift into a different action. So that's the drafted attempt to say, we acknowledge exploratory work is often needed, and we need some way to account for an action. But please, anyone here, cities, advocates, experts of all kinds, love to hear other ways to do that.
Kara, did you have some additional enlightenment on the exploratory issue?
I'll be brief because I think most of it has been said, but I certainly agree with what Julie's saying about exploratory work being the necessary path to inaction, and time being needed to do that exploratory work, because that time is not built into the HPS, right? So it's that if that's not acknowledged in the process, the review, for example, we're just not going to get anywhere. We need to have allowance for those exploratory measures as the path to an action, and credit, for lack of a better word, being given that the city is doing that. So maybe this kind of paradigm that Celestina pointed out, where the format right now is action completion, is oversimplification, right? There needs to be an expansion of that to allow for those exploratory paths if cities are realistically going to put actions into place. So yeah, I mean, maybe I think just trying to hit home that action completion is incomplete, because it doesn't capture everything. So I completely understand that there needs to be some outcome at the end of it, but the HPS process doesn't account for everything that needs to be accounted for if you're going to put an action into place. And that's where that exploratory function process comes into play.
I would encourage you all to take a look at the matrix on page 6. There's a definition of exploratory work, and to Madi and Celestina's request, sort of take a really hard look at that and think if it's accomplishing what you were just lining out, Tara and Julia and others have talked about, because I've heard that is the intent. And so I think we just want to make sure the language is lining up with the intent properly, and maybe it's not, is what I'm hearing. So if you could offer some language tweaks, I think that would be very helpful.
And I would just add, as you all are chewing on that and chewing on how it could or couldn't fit the timeline, Tara, I hear you asking of this work. And so I guess just to play that out and offer something for you all to give us more feedback on would be that, for Gresham, for metro cities, a timeline is 6 years that the actions have to be completed in. So if there are particular actions that the city knows need a little bit more exploratory work to further refine, that would be a great reason to put the completion date for that action, maybe a little bit later than some other actions that are ready to go and ready to be implemented right away. And so I think that's how we're seeing that there would absolutely be time for those initial exploratory pieces. But if that doesn't feel like it works, please do get us notes on that.
Great. I'm going to move us along because we have about 20 minutes of discussion time here. Kathy, thanks for your patience. Go right ahead.
I simply wanted to point out that there are ways of getting more than 1 in 20 units type A accessible. If you have federal money involved, you're going to be under the 5%, 2% requirement of Section 504, which is the highest level of accessibility because it uses the ANSI standards. And what it does is require that 5% of the units be mobility accessible and 2% be visually or hearing accessible.
Thank you for that. Definitely important to think about and important to try to figure out how to get this language right so that it's clear what the intentions are with encouraging type A or planning for type A. That's not just regulation we're talking about here. Matt, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a couple of things just to build on Kathy's comment there. I do think the letter from Sightline and Thousand Friends outlines well that another strategy would be to try to encourage development of the types of housing that are best that are opportunities, rich opportunities or opportunities. I'm not quite getting the phrase right for OHCS funding. Because tied to OHCS funding oftentimes is federal dollars. And then if you tie the federal dollars, then you have that opportunity for those Section 504 units. They're also referred to as UFAS units, or the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard units. And so that's even above type A. It's the best. And that's really what we want. And another thing is a different topic. So on the issue of AFFH, one idea or big idea I wanted to suggest to DLCD is to take a closer look at the proposed rulemaking that HUD has right now for AFFH, and to really comb through that a little bit and look at some of the definitions of terms that HUD's new proposed AFFH rules have. Because this is really an opportunity for the state of Oregon to define AFFH for the state of Oregon. And we don't know for sure whether those HUD proposed rules are going to go into effect, and that opportunity might go away. And so I think, there's a lot of terminology like community assets that are defined. They have a more precise definition of AFFH itself. Let me just mention a couple other of the words that they define. They have a specific definition for community engagement and fair housing choice. They have some additional language that I think is good. I think also where the rule talks about segregation, it focuses on racial segregation, but also to keep in mind that there's disability related segregation that these rules are intended to address as well. And the new AFFH proposed definitions do incorporate a bit of that concept of, racial, ethnic, and disability related segregation, because that's all critical to fair housing choice. But I'll put this in written comments because there's quite a few definitions from the proposed AFFH rules that might be useful to draw language from.
That's very helpful, Matt. Thank you for doing that and bringing that forward. Andre, question or comment? Reflection?
Yes. Yeah, Matt, thank you for speaking up about those definitions that are in federal law. I'd be super interested in seeing anything you come up with there and working with you and dialoguing with you on that as well. I appreciate your legal eye on things. So I do have two questions related to fair housing issues for DLCD staff. The first is just a question around the intent. First of all, thank you for including an additional fair housing area for cities to analyze. And my question has more to do with the wording. And I'm hoping that it's just a wording issue. The way that I read that new addition to the fair housing issue areas, which is really an old one that we're re-including, is that DLCD intends for cities to disrupt patterns of integration. And I don't think that's what the state really wants or intends, but and if it's not what you want or intend, I'd be thrilled to work with you on some other language that might work there and make that clear. So that's my first question, and maybe I'll pause there and wait and then ask my second question.
Not the intent at all. So please send us your language revisions for that, please. Thank you.
More than happy to do that. Yes, I was assuming that we were all on the same page there, of course. And then the second question has to do with accessibility and under characteristics, first of all, thank you for adding a definition of characteristics that includes a wide variety of things, including accessibility. And I'm wondering if staff has considered the possibility of actually requiring, not offering a safe harbor standard, but actually requiring that cities address in some way two types of characteristics, which we know are pretty much needed everywhere. One of them is dealing with accessibility, and the other is dealing with subsidy. As a housing type, subsidized housing as a housing type. So how cities can or might deal with that, and how they might set, I'll say set goals, that's not the right thing, but how that might be part of their translation process is at the discretion of the city, but just requiring that they address that in some way. I know cities hate new requirements, but these are just universally needed. And I would argue that it's really incumbent on everyone to try to step up in that regard. So have you considered that? And is that something that you wish to consider?
Yes, so I'll just take a minute here. Short answer, Andre, is yes. And the way that that work would be done would be through that fair housing issue area analysis, and including the issue areas related to housing choice for people with disabilities. And then the affordability piece is kind of embedded throughout. It's embedded in the housing, the housing production target, which will be separated by not only a number of units total, but by affordability. So that kind of affordability need is already predetermined. And the requirement to respond to those affordability needs is basically the whole work of the HPS, to pick actions that promote housing affordability and choice in response to the housing need. And again, those affordability brackets are already predetermined. So there's that second item. So in terms of the requirement generally, and be welcoming, again, as always, different ways to introduce the rule or convey or anything like that. But the requirement for the program is to identify these needs and then to take actions. So with that last addition that we added in the fair housing issue area process, to require a justification if a city thinks that no issues occur, then the program is clearly oriented, like you're saying, Andre, to the fact that we know that for the most part, these issues are present universally. And so it's just a matter of looking at the information, whatever information is available about those issues, and then selecting the actions to respond to them. So the requirement to be responsive to that need is present, but if there are other ways kind of within the program that you would think we could change that, please let us know. Mari, do you want to add anything?
I think the question is interesting, and so because I think, Celestina, you're right that the program is oriented to be responsive to not just those two types of characteristics that you're naming, Andre, accessibility and subsidy. It's a holistic picture of the needs that are identified locally and through the information, both at the state level and at the local level. And so I guess I'm having this moment of, please send us, and if there are areas that that this is not pulling through, and I saw some thumbs up from folks here, then that's the sort of information that we're seeking. So please send those comments in. Specifics is helpful. Generalized doesn't help us too much. So be as specific as possible. Just another call for a warm, open invitation to that, please. Thank you.
Happy to do that. Thank you.
Great. I see two hands up. I'm going to take those, and then I'd like, before we close, to circle back to the question about potentially unintended consequences or potential barriers that are being presenting by the rules. So I want to make sure we explore that just a little bit. But sorry, Brianne, you had your hand up. Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I have to jump off a little early, so thank you. Okay. Just in general, I was just going to say, I think as far as to go back to the safe harbor, I would say that I would be supportive. I'm supportive of adding the multi-unit attached to that kind of middle housing category. I think that's fine. It provides more flexibility. I do not support in general the adding the unit counts to those mixes. I don't even know. I think it would have a lot of unintended consequences of providing less flexibility in how to achieve those different mixes. And just practically speaking, from like a practitioner, I'm not even sure how we would really go about that. And then this is kind of shifting gears quickly. In general, I was really happy with what I saw in the guidance documents, concepts. And then one thing that I did see that I think would be helpful, and this is probably too late in the game to bring up, but I know there was the rental and homeowner vacancy rates. This is data and how we're doing our calculations. And then also changes in gross and net property values in rent over time. Both of those things from a practitioner standpoint are very difficult for us to nail down. We are spending so much time here talking about housing mix. Vacancy rate can shift that needle so much, and we're not even talking about that. And as far as need goes, and that number can be pretty subjective and really hard for this. I mean, we went through multiple iterations of how to figure out true vacancy rates in our city, looking at water usage, looking at all these things, and like any guidance, maybe that's something that in the guidance document, ideally that would be something that would be safe harbored. And you could prove otherwise of what your vacancy rate and your second home rate would be. But it's guidance on that would be very helpful. And then any kind of state data set on the rent and changes in rent over time would also be very helpful, because otherwise we're relying on consultants to get CoStar data and to get that data. And it's not overly reliable in my opinion, but just my thoughts. Thanks.
I'm on mute. There's a lot of leaf blowers in my neighborhood today. Sorry. Thank you for that. That's really helpful and practical feedback. Appreciate that. We'll think through how to respond. Julia, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Wanted to just kind of plus one Andre's note and also note that there are some specifics that we've already laid out in our letter that we submitted last week related to that. I'll also caveat that was before your new language in terms of requiring justification for not responding to things, which I think is an interesting tactic for that, but also I'm intrigued by that, and I think chew on it a little bit more, but the kind of a counter argument, I guess, would be just, I don't know, let's make the path of least resistance for cities to like do what we want them to do. And sometimes some baseline requirements, such as we know that accessibility and affordability are challenges everywhere, like maybe let's just line those out. And then when they show that there's need beyond what the state baseline requirement is, then that happens too. But yeah, so that's in our letter though. So I'll just leave it there for now.
Thanks, Julia. So in the last 5 or so minutes here, I would really like to hear about just sort of bigger picture reflections on the draft rules as they stand today. One, if you are feeling like there's portions of the rule that you think are sort of gelling and are getting sort of solid with some minor nudgings. And 2, if you think especially there are areas of rule where implementation could be leading to counteractive measures not counteractive, but conflicting ideas for the racial equity framework. So are there areas where rules might be unintentionally creating barriers or burdens on certain communities that we're hoping to plan for? Thoughts or reflections from a higher level now? None? Go ahead, Julia. Thank you.
I can let Shannon go first since I was just speaking.
Okay. All right. Shannon.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is my overarching concern about the concept of safe harbors. And again, if there are sideboards on those safe harbors, maybe I just need to be better informed about that. So it might be a lack of understanding versus what's actually happening in the rule. That said, I feel like prioritizing a certain configuration or type out of contextual considerations, I don't know, I guess from my perspective, it just has this potential to do a lot of unintended harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate that. Garland.
I think my concern is that it looks like we're still planning for cities of under 25,000 to be able to build at least 50% of their housing stock in single family homes. And since we know the entire parade of horribles of all the racial segregation, everything that single family homes produce, as well as the pressure to expand the urban growth boundary to pave over our farms and forest lands to produce more single family homes, I'm concerned that we're allowing such a large number in smaller jurisdictions, which means our suburbs and our rural communities that need more pressure on them to build less single family homes, that we're allowing such a high percentage in single family homes in most of the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Julia.
So I just wanted to flag, I don't know, kind of something that's been swimming around in my head this whole process is just the importance of order of actions, which I don't really know how that can or should be addressed in this process, but I don't know. I would be curious to have staff chew on that a little bit, meaning like if you're doing, affordability things on the front end, that usually helps mitigate or prevent some of the displacement that might occur if that's happening later in the process, ensuring that we're not just doing low-hanging fruit at the front end of the process because it's easy without actually thinking about the benefits of doing some of the harder things first, those types of stuff. I just think there's a lot of importance in order of processes that we haven't really gotten into.
Thank you. Yep, we've touched on those, but I hear you on that. Brock, go ahead.
I'm just going to give a near blanket disagreement to the comment that Garland just made. Small cities still need single family homes a lot of cities still need single family homes. And it's not the type itself, but the way that it was utilized in combination with other policies that was problematic in the past. It can provide ownership opportunities. We know that that's strongly desired among communities of color and other communities that have been marginalized from homeownership in the past. So I don't think it's I don't think that was a fair description of the issue.
Okay, thank you. Matt.
Yeah, so I had 3 comments. First, with regard to safe harbors, I wanted to just emphasize that, you know, safe harbors are like a shield for the jurisdictions in the end. They are, and I do think that DLCD could define the significance of the safe harbor, spell it out a little bit more, as Julia had suggested earlier. But the general idea behind a safe harbor is that it does provide, you know, some level of like legal protection or shield, something for the city to stand behind. And for that reason, I'm just trying to make the point that it's okay for those safe harbors to be more elevated in their expectations. These aren't requirements, they're safe harbors. And so we shouldn't shy away from, you know, being a little bit more ambitious when we're talking about safe harbors. With regard to single family homes, you know, setting aside that kind of the question of whether small jurisdictions need single family homes or not, I do want to just point out that in terms of accessibility, single family homes are very challenging because the current building code doesn't have any accessibility requirements for single family homes. So if we stress 50% of the new construction being, you know, 50 single family homes, I don't think we're going to achieve the, it'll be harder to achieve the accessibility thresholds in terms of the quantity of accessible units that we need to meet what's going to be growing demand because of our aging population. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is there has been discussion in previous NAPTAC meetings about kind of like the data poor environment or not having reliable data on certain things. And I just wanted to encourage DLCD not to fall back on non-action or lack of clear expectations. I think this is well stated in the letter from Sightline and 1,000 Friends. And, you know, there's a lot of other signatories to that letter that like Housing Land Advocates and Community Alliance of Tenants and Fair Housing Council of Oregon. And those kinds of baseline expectations, you know, because it's a data poor, if it's a data poor environment, we should be thinking about how are we going to develop that data. And I think that there's, even if the data is imperfect or more regional in nature, it can still guide us towards certain decisions. And that's a little vague, but it's also been kind of vaguely put out there that, you know, there are these data points that are very unreliable or hard to find. So I would just continue to challenge the agency that we should be trying to think about the programs or ways that we can actually obtain that data.
Thank you, Matt. I am sorry for those of you with your hands up. I'm going to let Alan have the last word and then close us out. You all know we'll recap how to get more comments back, and I'm sorry to do that to you all. Go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Deb. My comment is really around this. It's really spurred by the discussion we had around exploratory work and versus actions, and in thinking about it, you know, I was thinking about, you know, we were using a framework around what do cities get credit for in this work, and the flip side of that is what do they get credit for in the rules? The flip side of that is what are the rules incentivizing cities to do? And I think Julia hit on it in saying that, you know, if we aren't incentivizing or giving credit to cities to do certain things, then it actually might disincentivize them to do it, right? So we might actually be setting the bar lower by not incentivizing cities to do certain things. The example I think a good one was around
the SDC waivers, right? If it looks like it'd be too hard to do SDC waivers, we're not even going to try to explore it if we're not going to get credit for that. And so I think that's really something for us to think about, the way that framework of, again, we could flip it from getting credit for to what are the rules incentivizing cities to do, and I just think that that's that in the framework of, are we lowering the bar by not incentivizing cities to do certain things, is a real consideration. And we also heard that from Tara in the real world example of how they proceeded through with their consultant, in the consultant framing, well, this is what you're going to get credit for in the end, so this is what you should do. That actually set the bar for what was done. So I think we need to be careful about that in all instances. And I think the exploratory work versus actions is a really good example of that, but there certainly are others there that will have impacts on the outcomes that we're seeking.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So just to wrap us up here, it's a really good place to end. You all have given lots of thoughts about areas of the rule that need some further refinement or at least thinking on. And I know staff were already thinking about some of those, and that will be continued as we move along. Mari, if you haven't already, maybe you could pull up the schedule slide for us so we can take a look at what's coming up and talk about further comments. Great, thank you. So unless you are already aware, maybe you're not already aware, tomorrow the RAC, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, is meeting from 9 to noon. It'll be a good one to listen in on. There are many of these topics and more about additional safe harbor ideas that the RAC will discuss, some real sort of policy discussion there. And then feedback for rules will be best provided by 9/9 to get into the next version, or if you want them to be considered for the next version of rules, which will be the version that gets published on October 1st. So if you have additional thoughts, I know many of you have already been sending and are continuing to send, and this conversation and the RAC conversation will be building into that. But if you have other especially specific language at this point that you would like staff to consider, send that along. And I think Mari will probably follow up with an email about, how to send that along, as she always does, and how to label your feedback. And then we are scheduled, RAC will meet again early October after the publication. We are scheduled for a couple of meetings in October. We think those will happen. We'll keep you posted if there's a change as this moves along. And then also just want to highlight that LCDC is having a public hearing on the draft rules on October 24th. And I don't know if a time has been set for that. Is there any illumination on that?
Time is still TBD, but that is a typo, y'all. Apologies.
Oh,
that's an oversight on my end. It should have been October 25th. It's not October 24th.
Thank you. I didn't think that sounded right, but there it was on the slide. Great. Thank you for the clarification. So October 25th, but of course we will make sure you get notification about that leading up to that, and what the process is for providing testimony, et cetera. So that's where we're headed. We will see some of you at the RAC meeting tomorrow, and then otherwise NAPTAC will reconvene on October 16th. Send in comments by Monday if you would like your comments and thoughts about draft rules to be considered for the next round that gets published on October 1st by the Secretary of State. Any last minute comments or questions from Mari, Celestina?
Just a big thank you all for all your continued input, really, and a continued welcoming for more. Mari?
Ditto. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you for getting us here, and we'll keep working on it. Appreciate it.